In this training, we mainly focus on the Blazor application. Therefore, to avoid extending the training, I have created the code for our backend libraries in the meantime, and now we will quickly go over it. Of course, as always, you will be able to download this code in the last lesson of this module. Let's start with the shared project. In this project, we use mediator and CQRS. Therefore, I have created a division into commands and queries, as well as DTO objects. Here, we will have commands that must implement the iRequest interface from mediator. The logic will be in the application layer, and I will show you how this logic looks in a moment. So these commands only contain properties, which are parameters passed to the web API and data retrieved from the web API, just like in our queries, i.e., the data here in this place, and validation attributes, like here in this place, required for the title. So here we have commands like add, task, command, which involve adding a new task and properties such as title, description, completion status, deadline, and image URL. Then we have deleting a task based on the ID passed to this command, editing a task based on the ID to update the title, description, completion status, or deadline, and a command for uploading a file to the server where the file is passed as iForm file. Next, we have DTO, specifically task DTO, which represents our task and the data we want to display in our application. Then we have queries, starting with get, edit, task, query, which retrieves task data based on the ID for editing. We pass the ID and receive the corresponding data. Then we have get, task, query, which doesn't require any parameters, but returns a list of task DTOs that we created. This is the shared project. Next, we have the domain project, which contains only one domain model named task. So, such a table will be created in the database with these columns. And here's an important point. If you refer to this task class, you will often need to provide the full namespace, because task is also used with asynchronous methods. To ensure Visual Studio knows you are referring to this task, you will often need to use the full namespace. This name is somewhat unfortunate, but it's what I used in our project. Next, we have the infrastructure layer, where we primarily configure Entity Framework Core. Here we have a configuration class, set the table name, specify that title can have a maximum length of 100 characters, and similarly set the maximum length for the description to 500 characters. Then we have the migration and the application DB-context class, which is our context with Entity Framework Core. As you can see, I had to refer to this task using the full namespace address. If I did it this way, Visual Studio would think I'm referring to system.threading.tasks. Task, so you will most often need to provide the full namespace. We also have a service, file, service here, because I want to show you how to handle files in Blazor. Inside, we really only have one method, upload, which uploads a file to the server to the path www.root content files. So we will be passing the file here. Then, as I mentioned, we will be uploading our file to this path www.root content files. Importantly, in this project, we also have dependency injection classes where we register all these services. Here, we have DB context, file service, database connection string, and this method is called in the web API. Specifically in the program.cs file, add infrastructure because we need to call it through the web API. So we register these services from the infrastructure layer here. Next, we have the application layer where we define the interfaces we work with in this layer, namely the iApplication context and iFile service. So, if we want to work with an implementation from the infrastructure layer, which is a higher layer, we do it here through interfaces. Additionally, we have handlers for our commands and queries, which means the logic is here. The commands and queries are defined in the shared layer, and here we can say their implementation is. These commands and queries are defined in the shared layer because they will be called in the web API and primarily in the client. So we need access to these commands in these two projects. Thanks to the mediator, it works in such a way that we call the command we have access to in the client, and the server application connects it with the handler, which is the logic. And here is the logic. We add a new task. We inject DB context here and add the new task to the database. Similarly, we have delete here, removal, edit task. Here we update the task data and upload a file to the server, and here we simply call the file service and the upload method. As for queries, we retrieve task information here and return the data from this query. And similarly for tasks, we retrieve all tasks from the database and return them, i.e. a list of task DTOs. Just like in infrastructure, we also have a dependency injection class here, and we register the mediator here, and this logic is invoked in the web API here in the program.cs class. At this point, here we have add.application. Great. And finally, we have our web API. Here we have, of course, controllers and exposed endpoints that will be called in Blazor. We have a base controller and a task controller that inherits from it. And we call all these commands here through the mediator. So, for example, we call a query here, and this handler from the application layer is called. Similarly, if we have commands, we call the add task command through the mediator here, and at that moment, the logic from the application layer is executed. Add task command handler. That's how it's connected. If you want to delve into this architecture, I can recommend the ASP.NET Core School as I go deeper into this topic there. But here, as I mentioned, we want to focus mainly on Blazor. What else do we have new here? In app settings, I added the connection string to the database. So here, I defined it for myself and will create such a database locally on my computer. And in the program CS, apart from the standard methods, we have a call from the dependency injection class from our application and infrastructure layers. And we also have CORS configuration here, which is cross-origin request, because the web API and the client application can be on different servers. So we have this entry here, and below we have this entry. Oh, and here I also added an entry regarding the use of static files, because in the web API, we will be saving files uploaded from Blazor. So I also had to add this entry, and here in the web API, I had to change invariant globalization to false, because I was getting such an error when trying to update the database. And now, if you want to create a database at this point, you must remember two things above all. First, in the package manager console, you always need to have the infrastructure layer, where we have our entity framework core configuration defined. Secondly, note that we are using multiple startup projects here, meaning we are running two projects. However, if you are updating the database, you need to set the web API project as the startup project. You can do this here, for example, or by right-clicking on the web API and selecting Set as Startup Project. Then you type Update Database, press Enter, and the database should be created, provided you have the correct connection string for the database. I have already created this database earlier, okay? I will restore it so that when the application starts, both the web API and the client application will run. Oh, and we can also look at the NuGet packages, as I had to install a few. Here you can see which libraries we are using, including Mediator, ASP.NET Component WebAssembly, which is standard in Blazor. Here you can also examine and see where and in which projects we have installed which libraries. Okay, and here we have Entity Framework Core. So I actually installed Entity Framework Core, Tools, SQL Server, Design, and Entity Framework Core. Then Features, Hosting, and Mediator. So you will also need to install these libraries yourself, or, as I mentioned, you can copy them from the last lesson of this module. In Web API, we use Swagger, so we can view all endpoints in developer mode. So now I am launching the application. I will go to Launch Settings in Web API. In the browser, I will enter this address, and here you need to append Swagger, and at this point, you have access to all these methods. So we have the get method to retrieve information about a specific task, the post method to create a new task, get to retrieve information about all tasks, put for updating, delete for deleting, and post upload image for uploading images. So now, in our Blazor application, we will refer to this API, meaning we will refer to this URL. This is the base URL, and we will append this path to it, which is API task edit in this case, and we pass the identifier here if we want to retrieve information about a specific task. If we want to create a new task, we similarly have the base address, append API tasks, and in the body, we pass the information in JSON that needs to be saved in the database. So here we simply have an overview of all the endpoints we have defined in the tasks controller, meaning we have all the logic for each endpoint, and in each one, as I mentioned, we either call a command, like in this case, or a query, like in this case. And here is the definition of all these methods. So that's it for the back end of the application. And now I invite you to the next lesson, where I will show you how we will call Web API endpoints in Blazor.